Welcome to episode 3 in Worldview Dilemma, and this episode we're going to continue the question, why is anarchism the solution, to the problems that humanity faces? And, when proposing such a solution, sometimes you're met with hostility or some pushback, and people assume you're talking about, you want everything to be violent and chaos and insane because you're using a word that they associate with those things. But this presentation is going to great lengths to show, as many others have done, that the system in place is violent, chaotic, and insane, and that the governments and the corporations and the banks and the think tanks that set protocols into motion, that this empire is wreaking havoc on human society, and we're not just talking about one particular government or another, but a network of governments. It's an entire ruling class system that maintains its power with the threat and initiation of violence. And ultimately the police and military are, regular people from regular neighborhoods that go and work for the state and obey orders and maintain that power differential between the ruling class and the rest of humanity. And as I was saying at the end of episode 2, I showed this pin up above, Born Anarchist, which a friend of mine posted the other day. And I do think it is accurate to say that anyone born with a conscience or a capacity for conscience is born an anarchist. Because conscientious people don't want to see people dominated. They don't want to see people ruled over and controlled and enslaved. And the conscience is, of course, something that has to be nurtured in life. You can't, just because we're born with the capacity for one doesn't mean we will grow up to become conscientious people. But there are many obstacles in the way of us becoming truly conscientious, and the ruling class at present is controlling the curriculum for state education, which most people are subjected to. And then not to say that private school is much better in many cases as far as providing a true moral education. And unfortunately, even, sometimes if parents were to homeschool their children, they themselves might not even provide their children with a true moral education because they are lacking that themselves. And so we end up passing on all these insane ideologies from generation to generation. But if we really ask the question at the root of our hearts, if anyone has the right to dominate another, the heart is, if you have a functioning conscience, your heart is necessarily at odds with some people ruling over others. And so currently we have a lot of people who have the capacity for conscience in this world who have not fully stepped into that capacity because there's some ideology in the way. And I was saying how, you start off by saying the simplest sentence in the world, like, everyone has equal rights. I mean, some people wouldn't say that. Some people would of course, propose unequal rights in a blatant fashion. But a lot of people would want to say, yeah, I do think that we all are born with equal rights and that we should respect that. But if you continue that line of reasoning, then by the second sentence, you're a radical. in this world, because love is the most radical thing. And by radical, I'm referring to the etymological root meaning of that word, which is radix, and that word radix means root. So to be a radical is, it's used, that word, just like any other word, is used many different ways. But if we're going to stick to the etymological meaning, it would imply that you're getting at the root of the problem, which is some people claiming power over others. Whether it's the pretext for that is the color of skin, or nationality, religion, gender, any other thing that could divide us, or the pretext that, well, I work for this institution known as the government, so therefore I do have the right to abuse you. Therefore I have more rights than you. Therefore I have the right to drag you into a cage for, inhaling some substance. Therefore I have the right to invade your country and, exterminate a large percentage of your population, or whatever other insane, whatever the example is. Government agents of the state perform insane and heinous deeds and claim the right to do it all legally, right? And so we're, over the course of this presentation, we're exposing that fact, and as many have done. And if you don't use the word anarchy, and you just describe what you're referring to, that we should honor equal rights, that we should respect bodily autonomy, that we should refrain from enslaving one another, you'll get many people on board with that. If you keep it somewhat vague as to what that means, if you don't extrapolate beyond that, you'll probably get a lot of people to say, I agree with all those things. But when you extrapolate on that principle, you come to find out that you cannot be a statist. You cannot propose the legitimacy or necessity of the state while honoring the principle of bodily autonomy and the right of people to not, be dominated and enslaved by others. You cannot coherently honor that principle without being an anarchist. Whether you call it anarchy or not, you can call it abolition. You can say you're an abolitionist. You can say you're, again, a freedom advocate, a voluntarist. Whatever word you want to use to describe that, and whatever language you want to use, there are many synonyms for it, but none of those synonyms would involve being a statist, would involve any word that denotes the existence of the state. So if you're an anarchist, you're not a communist. You're not a socialist. You're not a Democrat. You're not a Republican. You're not a liberal. You're not a conservative. Because all of those ideologies propose that a government is necessary. And people call themselves anarcho-communists. They call themselves anarcho-capitalists. But as we'll show through the course of this presentation, there is no need to hyphenate anarchism with any other word. And there's no way to hyphenate anarchy or anarchism with communism or capitalism in a coherent way. It's a shame that so many people consider themselves anarcho-communists, but they are contradictions in terms. That's a contradiction in terms. Now, many will debate this, and we'll get into the counter arguments. They'll say, well, communism is the way towards statelessness, and but this is a fantasy to imagine that you can get to a stateless society by setting up a massive state. Power structures don't dissolve themselves. The state will never dissolve itself. People have to dissolve or abolish the state by evolving beyond the belief in authority, believing in some people's right to rule over others. A critical mass of human beings would have to evolve beyond the belief and speak and act accordingly, and then all ruling class systems could be abolished, right? If the critical mass were there. Obviously, to do that on a worldwide basis would take great numbers of people. And we're very far, very, very far from that. But there's no better way to attempt that strength in numbers, no better way than speaking out and trying to spread the message, the philosophy, and hopefully inspire and influence others to abandon the belief in authority, so that we can gradually evolve, or as quickly as possible evolve as a species beyond this insane coexistence. And we'll return to how important it is to speak out in that effort over the course of this presentation. But, whenever you're trying to speak out, even if it's a conversation between you and one other person, or whether it's done publicly on the internet or whatever, you'll of course attract many different counter arguments, and that's just part of the work, of course. But you'll sometimes find that if you don't use the word anarchism and you just describe what you're talking about, a lot of people will agree with you and be on board with it. But as soon as you state that to truly honor equal rights and bodily autonomy, you cannot be a statist, that you're actually condoning, whether wittingly or not, you're condoning some form of slavery or another by being a statist, because no government has ever honored bodily autonomy. All governments do claim to own people implicitly. They may not come out and say it. Some governments do it in a more brutal fashion. Some governments are obviously much more mass murderous than others, but all governments claim to own citizens in a variety of ways, and we spoke about many ways that governments do that in episode 2, but we'll return to that over the course of this presentation. But so this meme here is something you can describe in detail that almost everyone agrees with until you say its name. And I've found again and again that you can that a lot of people would like to think that they do honor equal rights between human beings, and that they do honor people's equal right to be left alone from enslavement, that they do honor bodily autonomy. But there is often, very often, a contradiction within people's worldview that needs tending to, so that their hearts and minds can align with this principle. So let's move on to the next slide. No matter how they spin it, freedom is not extreme. Control is extreme. And government actually etymologically means control. That's what the word means. To govern means to control, to control or to steer. So you're not talking about a government is not an organization or structure or society or an institution that merely claims the right to protect and care for people. It's, in other words, a government is not a protectorate. It's a government, and government means to control. It doesn't mean to serve and protect. At the etymological root, it means to control. Now, sometimes people will act as if etymology is not important. But don't you think that the root meaning of words is significant? Right? It comes from a word in Latin that means to control. And that is an extreme thing to base your worldview on. And don't you think enough people over time basing their worldview on control has led to the current situation we're in, which is a very unequal, unjust world where people are dominated and controlled, in whether militaristically, economically, or in some other way. And if you base your worldview on control, and then say you're a good person and you want people to be free and be respected and to have equal rights, again, there's a contradiction that needs to be sorted out. Because to want people to be free is not an extreme position to take. It's a common sense and moral position to take. It's, very extreme, on the other hand, to say, no, I want the human race to be controlled by a governing class, by a ruling class, people that claim the authority to control other people's lives, to control their labor, their daily life force, and where it goes, or where substantial sums of it go. And we'll also get into banking and how banking is another form of theft, and how much human energy is monopolized and controlled through the banking paradigm. Let's move on. Another thing you'll hear a lot is, well, without government, there would be chaos, there would be madness, right? But one thing that this argument ignores is that how much chaos and madness and violence is perpetrated by the state itself. So in this meme, you have all the scary things you claim would happen without the state, or things that are currently happening with the state, right? The state perpetrates most of the murder on earth through warfare, right? And it perpetrates most abduction on earth, and theft and coercion, and various other acts of harm. So the state is also not preventing the violence done between regular folks who don't work for the state. The agents of the state generally show up after the violence is already done. So if someone in a neighborhood attacks someone else, or if there's an instance of domestic violence, or something like that, well, generally speaking, the state is not preventing that, but rather arriving after the damage is done and then administering some form of punishment. But that form of punishment is not leading to healing or rehabilitation, prevention, or evolution. It's leading to even more harm, right? I mean, it depends on which government we're talking about, but some prison systems are particularly notorious in this world for being kind of breeding grounds for a whole lot of crime, right? There's a whole lot of rape and assault and murder that happens within prison. There's a whole lot of drug use, right? Whereas, people are being dragged into cages on the basis of having used drugs or having sold drugs, and yet they often come to find out, well, there's even more drugs being used in the prisons than per square foot, let's say, than in their own neighborhoods, right? Because in many prisons, the guards are in on, they're getting, paid to look the other way, right? Or so there's a whole there's just such a moral rot to the prison system, and I'm not saying it's morally decrepit to use drugs, right? I'm not saying that's your body. You have the right to put the substance you want into your body. If it is harming you, someone does have the right to intervene or in some way and say, hey, look, I'm worried about you. Let's see if we can get you to rehab, or hey, I got to get away from you because you're bringing me down. Because obviously, if you take a lot of drugs, that does affect your behavior, and that will affect other people's lives too. But what the justice so-called system does is abduct people and throw them into cages for having used substances. So imagine if someone's using a substance, and even if that substance were harmful to the person using it, what right does that give you to harm them? If you walk up to a friend and they're harming themselves, well, does that give you the right to assault them or abduct them or throw them in a cage or harm them? Just because they're harming themselves, it doesn't give you the right to harm them, right? And then people are dragged into these cages, and then there's just as much or even more drugs being used inside those cages than on the outside, and it just points to all the contradiction of the whole system. That's called justice. It's called a justice system, but it has nothing to do with justice. It's not preventing crime by and large. It's not rehabilitating or healing. And so much crime is flowing, and acts of despair or petty theft or all these things. So much of it is flowing from scarcity and the economic warfare that people are under, which creates a whole cycle of dog eat dog behavior, right? And the state has no interest in healing that or rectifying that. The state is a perpetrator of that economic warfare, in fact. So the state is not interested in getting at the root causes of what's leading to violence between people. And the state actually does the bulk of the violence in this world. And the governments have murdered nearly 300 million people in the last 100 years alone. So it is the most mass murderous institution in the history of humanity. I mean, obviously monarchies and empires are up there as well, but it's really, the state is really just a continuation of those older forms of rulership. It used to be that humanity was ruled over by a king or a queen. Obviously monarchies still exist, but now we have governments which is an oligarchy instead of a monarchy. Instead of having one ruler, we have several, who amongst themselves through majority rules voting claim the right to be able to decide on legislation that affects everyone else and everyone else's lives without their consent. So, and voting is not consent, and we're going to get to that later on in this presentation. Hopefully, in this episode, we'll come to the question of voting, because some people think, well, voting makes all of this legit, it makes it consensual, but we'll prove that that's not the case. So, let's move on. This is really saying the same thing, where if you can't trust people with freedom, how can you trust people with power? So, when I saw this meme, it jumped out at me immediately, because it's a very concise way to expose the contradiction in many people's worldview, because people will often say, well, human beings are inherently bad or dangerous, so we need a governing class that keeps everyone in check, because you can't trust people to be free. So then, okay, so if you can't trust people to be free, then why would you take a subset of those same people and put them in charge of everyone else? If you can't even trust people to be free, then why would you trust some people to have power over others? Right? If you're saying people are inherently untrustworthy, if that's your worldview, then why would you take a subset of those people and then give them the authority to rule over others and expect it to go well? So we'll continue with this. We'll pick up with that thought throughout the presentation. I'm sure we'll come back to that point. So I think this is a very good representation of the difference between statism and anarchism. It's often portrayed as the opposite, but this I do think is quite an accurate depiction. So above you have people, obviously using the violence, and you don't know exactly the context and who's operating in self-defense and who's not, but it looks like someone is violently dominating another, right? So statists arguing over how to use government violence on other people. So how should this is the left and right are both in this picture, right? Saying, well, I think the tax dollars should go to this thing, I think it should go to that thing, I think it should go to healthcare, no, I think it should go to the police, right? But all of that comes with the threat of violence, that if you don't pay those taxes, well, the state claims the right to do violence onto people and drag them into cages, right? So it really comes down to, well, I think people should be forced to pay for other people's healthcare, or else violence should be done to them. And someone else is saying, well, no, I think people should be forced to fund the police, or else violence should be done to them. Right? Whereas at the bottom is anarchists discussing how to promote peace by leaving each other alone. Well, how can we pool resources to have healthcare and protection without claiming to own each other? How can we coexist without enslaving each other in any way? Can't we put our conscience and imagination to that great problem? Right? Can't we have a meeting of minds and come up with solutions without using the threat of violence to resolve anything? Without saying, well, if you don't do what I want you to do, and if you don't fund the institutions I want you to fund, I'm going to have someone with guns come to your door and threaten to put you in a cage. And if you resist their arrest, they're going to do what the people in the top photo are doing. Let's move on. Let's see if I've got this correct. You believe people can't govern themselves, but you believe some people can govern hundreds of millions of other people. This is another great encapsulation of the statist worldview. So you think people are too dumb, too dangerous, too incompetent to govern their own lives. That people don't have the right to self-governance, to self-direction, to self-determination. That they need someone above them that has authority over them. You think people can't govern themselves, they can't be self-governing, but you think some people can govern everyone else. And you think that's going to go well. Rather than trying to provide knowledge and spread it far and wide, and and from as young an age as possible, to help put people in the position to best govern their own lives. And if they, don't respect other people's right to be left alone from domination, well, then people do have the right to defend themselves. But why would you take a subset of the human population and give them the authority to not have to respect bodily autonomy and not have to respect people's right to be left alone from domination? How is that going to solve anything? If we're there's no one that's coming to save us. If people are bad people, they're gonna, bad to each other. If they treat each other badly, if they have crazy ideas in their head of how they have the right to treat each other badly, and if a critical mass of people hold those beliefs and act on those beliefs, we're gonna co-create a very messed up world, right? And there's no system that can fix that problem. That is a mental and spiritual problem that has to fix so that our behavior can fix. And by spiritual, we're talking about emotional, right? So the human psyche has to undergo an evolution for us to co-create a more fair coexistence, right? And the way to achieve that is not by taking a subset of the human population and giving the authority to dominate over others and forcibly extract labor and use the threat of violence to enforce obedience to those arbitrary dictates. Would you trust some random person on the street to be your president? To have authority over you? To tell you what you can put in your body, what you can't, where you can go on earth, what paperwork you need to cross invisible lines, how much labor you owe them? And would you trust them with the right to threaten you with violence and caging if you were to, disobey their commands? Would you trust a regular person on the street with such power over you? If not, why would you trust some person on television with that much power over you, claiming to be your president? What makes them inherently more trustworthy? They're just a person too, and you just finished saying that people are corruptible and that people can be bad, right? And no one's disputing that. So why would you imagine that giving someone that much power over millions of other people would not corrupt them? In fact, isn't it someone seeking power in the first place that is already inherently corrupt? Why would you want power over others unless you were attracted to having power over others? Isn't that inherently suspect? So yeah, why should one person, calling themselves the president, or who we call the president, or prime minister, or dictator, whatever, king, queen, or why would a group of people, who we call Congress or Parliament or whatever, why should so few people have the authority to, decide on what the law is for everyone else? Isn't the law a pre-existing principle that does not flow from the dictates of people in power or any person at all? It's a pre-existing principle that we don't own each other. To be a lawmaker is to play God. Say, well, I get to make up the law. It's like saying, well, I get to be the arbiter of the law of physics, and I'm going to change the law of physics. It's the same thing to say, I'm going to change the law of right and wrong. I'm going to change the law of love and justice. And I get to determine right now that, blowing up your house is right. Well, no, it isn't. You're just playing God. Why would you trust one person or a small group of people to have authority over millions, if not billions, of other people's lives? defunding the police versus defunding the entire government. We're going to have to get into this in greater depth, because people will say, hey, well, how are people? A lot of people are quite dependent on the government right now for food, for shelter, for assistance, right? And this is the classic move of a narcissist psychopath to want to foster dependency on their they want their victims, anyone, seeking power over someone else, and if they want to maintain that power differential, they want their victims to be dependent upon them for their survival, right? And this is not to shame anyone who is dependent on the state currently for food or shelter for their survival, because people have been so massively stolen from by the system that it's understandable why people seek whatever assistance they can get, because they've literally been enslaved by the system. But nevertheless, it is a dynamic of people relying on their abuser to be their protector and be their, provider and caretaker. So people themselves, regular people themselves, would have to step up, especially in the immediate aftermath of abolishing the state, right, as a thought experiment. If that were to happen, there would be a period of chaos that would likely ensue, right? Because it would be a moment of great upheaval. But in that kind of moment, people would have to step up and care for each other and look out for each other, so as to not let their neighbors starve, so as to make sure people have the access to what kind of medicine they need, so their lifeline is not cut off, right? And it would be up to people to look out for each other so that people can break free from this paradigm of being dependent upon their abuser for their survival. And a lot of people say, well, if there was no such thing as taxation, people would never share. For one thing, they wouldn't share voluntarily. Therefore, we have to, set up this whole preemptive system that controls and extracts people's labor coercively, to enforce that reallocation of resources, redistribution of wealth, right? But so many people who say we need the state to enforce, that redistribution of wealth, they themselves defend taxation, and they themselves say they're willing to pay taxes, right? Because it goes to other people who need it, right? A lot of people will defend taxation on that basis. So why don't they themselves share directly? If they're willing to share, then why don't they do it voluntarily and directly without going through this violent middleman that's also oppressing people and dominating, enslaving people? Why go through this violent middleman that threatens everyone with violence to enforce obedience? Why trust someone or a group of people who are treating people like that? That's a fundamentally untrustworthy energy, to approach people with that kind of energy and threat and violence to them. That should be a red flag right away. That, no, I can't trust this entity to manage the business of sharing. And it's led to a whole lot of monopoly, and we'll talk in great depth of tax dollars, taxation, and where taxation has gone, what people are funding. But it has, on a global level, on a global scale, has led to monopoly and scarcity. It has been a device of theft. And this is really getting at the same dynamic here. Help your neighbor and take care of the poor and hungry. You mean give money to the Romans and let them do it, right? Okay, I'm going to start over. Let me know where I lost you. And you see this miscommunication right here, this kind of confusion. And when he says, help your neighbor and take care of the poor and hungry, and people interpret it as, you mean give money to the Romans and let them do it. Just that miscommunication, that misunderstanding right there has created a whole, humanity has gone down a whole wrong direction. Like they took a wrong turn based on this simple misunderstanding. That sharing and helping your neighbor and caring for one another and being there for one another and looking out for one another, that is your personal responsibility. Don't abdicate that and expect the ruling class that is forcibly extracting people's energy to be the kind of people that have people's best interests at heart. And the Romans, they instituted taxation on a much more worldwide basis. They weren't the first to do it, but they definitely furthered its globalization. And now taxation is the standard. It's and has been for quite a while. And it was the same under feudalism, but it's important to know that, and with monarchies and everything, but it's the same to know that it's a ruling class institution. It's a ruling class device. And it has nothing to do with what the sentiment up above is describing. Caring for each other. This is not the way to do it. You don't give it to the Romans. You don't let the Romans steal from you. You don't acquiesce to that. You unite to oppose them. You don't expect the Romans to do a good job of sharing. Because first of all, they're stealing from everyone. That has nothing to do with sharing. They're invading, conquering, enslaving, brainwashing, and stealing and people's daily labor. And funding their wars and their prisons with that labor. But unfortunately, this misunderstanding is still rampant. A lot of people still defend taxation, still believe this is the necessary way to pool resources, instead of just becoming better people and sharing with each other. And anyway, if we were all not so stolen from, we would have more to share. I mean, why do you think people have been, in many cases worked their entire lives and are still broke? Right? Because they're being stolen from every day of their lives. Not only through taxation, but also through banking and other ways too. But the whole monetary system is a system based in theft, and we'll expose all that in great detail. But what was I going to say? People have been working their whole lives and still broke. They obviously have much more to share and have much more that they can pass on to their children or people they want to share with, if they weren't being so stolen from. And I guess, we'll just leave it there for now and come back to that over the course of the presentation. There's no government like no government. And that's the truth right there. And there have also been societies that have existed without centralized authority, or without basing the whole social contract on authority, of the right to rule. Many people point to the book The Dawn of Everything, that goes over the history of humanity and shows that many different types of societies have existed, and that government is just one way to do things, not the only way to do things. Okay, so now we come to voting. But let's just back up here, because pre-colonial times, you can find good examples of societies and tribes throughout much of the world that coexisted without taxation, without mass incarceration or any prisons, actually, without police, much less militarized police. Does not to say there wasn't war, not to say there wasn't factions that battled, and not to say it was a perfect world, not to say people were always free, but there was a greater degree of freedom. And there wasn't a monetary system or a banking system of fiat currency based in debt and interest and fractional reserve lending and inflation, right? And yet people survived. You don't need all those things to survive. And in fact, those things jeopardize people's survival. So, we'll return to that over the course of the presentation, but, we'll leave it there for now. Voting is not a right. You do not have the right to choose a master for other people to obey. Right? So let's get into this in some depth, because people often think, well, voting is what makes government legitimate. And many of the same people will say, yeah, I agree that monarchy is unjust, that there should be a king or a queen with, authority over millions of people, and they, of course, claim the divine right to rule, that God had given them the right to rule over humanity, had ordained them with that responsibility. And that was just merely a claim they were making. It wasn't the truth. And some, people went along with it for a while, believed in it. Obviously their religious leaders were saying the same thing, and some people got tricked to believe in the legitimacy of monarchy. But over time, more and more people were able to see through it, and tired of that arrangement. So the ruling class went to work to really give people the same thing, but repackaged as government. And now we're told that we are giving government the authority to rule over us. Or really what we're told is we're giving government the authority to represent us. And that government, members of government are representatives and public servants, that they're not rulers, right? This is sort of the mythology of government. But they do claim the right to forcibly extract labor using the threat of violence. They do claim the right to tell you where you can and can't go on Earth. They do, what paperwork you need to cross those invisible lines, and they claim the right to tell you what you can put in your body, what you can't put in your body, what the punishments are for putting something in your body that you shouldn't put in your body. They claim the authority to mandate you putting something in your body, right, and threaten you with, unemployment, or exclusion from school or society if you don't accept certain medical procedures. They claim the authority to censor speech. Some governments have been particularly draconian to that end. Certain governments have claimed the right to tell people what they can or can't wear. Right? We had the what was it, last year or 2 years ago? What year are we now? But it was obviously very recently where we had the all the protests in Iran, where people are sick and tired of being told what they must wear on their head. What women must wear on their head. I mean, the government is claiming to own people's bodies, straight up. How else do you have the right to tell someone what they can or can't put on their body? What they can wear on their head or their body? What right does anyone have to threaten caging and violence to someone if they disobey those dictates? That is an implicit claim of ownership. That is a form of slavery, straight up. And France and Quebec have done the same thing, but but instead of forcing women to wear the hijab, France and Quebec have both passed legislation that bans the hijab, at least from certain workplaces and things. Right? In Quebec, I don't know if the law still stands, but for a while, and it might still stand, if you work for the government as a government employee, you couldn't legally wear the hijab, right? So now again, the governments are claiming to own the heads and bodies of those women, saying you cannot wear something on your head. Well, the government is claiming to own your head. It's claiming to own you. So government is not representation, right? It's coercion. Taxation is coercion because it comes with the threat of harm, the threat of persecution. It's not a voluntary consensual arrangement, like we were saying before. Even if you are going along with it and acquiescing to it now and thinking that it's a good idea, well, if you change your mind and oppose taxation tomorrow, it doesn't matter. You're still under the legal obligation to pay up, which is proof that it doesn't hinge on your consent. Government is not representation because you can't represent someone coercively. Obviously, governments also declare war and murder millions of people and commit genocide and force people to fund that under the threat of incarceration, and have been known in many cases to force people to fight in those wars. So the ruling class is declaring war, and then they're saying, well, you, our slaves, our subjects, must fight in that war, those wars, or else we're going to throw you in a cage. All of that is slavery. All of that is implying that they own you. How else do you have the right? I mean, just imagine you start a fight with someone and say, well, now you walk up to someone else and you say, well, now you have to go fight that person, or else I'm going to put you in a cage. I'm going to fight you. The state is a bully. The state is not representing people. It is coercing people. Coercion is not representation because you can't represent someone against your will. If you let's say you get sick, right, and you can't attend a certain meeting, and someone else is going to that meeting, and you say, well, could you represent my point of view at the meeting? And they faithfully and accurately repeat what you ask them to repeat. Well, now they're representing your point of view, and it's done in a consensual, voluntary basis. That's an example of someone representing someone else's point of view. That's not what government does. Governments do all kinds of things that are very harmful, and then when people protest those things, generally speaking, they don't stop doing those things. They don't listen to the people. They're not obliged legally to listen to the people, right? They can say, well, too bad, we declare war, and we're funding this, like the U.S. is funding Israel, and Israel's committing genocide, but too bad, we've decided we have to fund Israel and give them tens of billions of dollars of your money, and you don't have a right to say no to that. And then people are going to vote for Kamala Harris or Trump, right? It's madness. It's like Stockholm syndrome, basically. People are really not thinking things through. If they think they have the right to vote for these mass murderous institutions that have murdered tens of millions of people throughout the globe over the decades and centuries. But again, this is not just a presentation on the U.S. government, right? Because people often say, well, that's a problem you have in the U.S., and they acknowledge that the U.S. government is evil. Well, yes, the U.S. government is one of the most evil governments of all time. But all governments do claim the right to rule over people, to coercively extract labor, to unilaterally decide where that goes, to pass laws unilaterally, and laws that apply to people's bodies against their will. And if people protest, well, too bad, we passed the law. So you have to try to vote for someone else in, and maybe they'll change the law again. And so you're always held hostage by one party or another that claims to have the right to decide the fate of people's bodies and lives. And ultimately, that is slavery. That's what that really is. It's just that we tend to use that word slavery to refer to only specific kinds of slavery, and we use the word to refer to the most brutal forms of slavery, right? The most obvious and brutal and violent and horrific forms of enslavement. But if you use the word to only refer to the most abject and total forms of enslavement, then you're ignoring the spectrum of slavery that exists, right? And you're imagining that everything other than plantation slavery is freedom. And that's simply not the case. So it's very important to, that the definition of the word is broad enough to include all forms of slavery that exist. And we are referring, government is slavery. That's what it is. That's what it truly is. And the fact that we euphemize it, it's not the only form of slavery. There are many forms of slavery, but it is a form of slavery. So government is slavery, and euphemizing it is so powerful. Calling it government instead of slavery allows people to support it. Calling them politicians or leaders or presidents and prime ministers instead of slave masters is so powerful because it allows people to support it. Whereas if you really just say it what it is, well, then it's very clear what you're supporting and how you have no moral right to support it. So again, in the past, kings and queens, they said, well, God gave us the right to rule over all of you. But now we're told, well, no, you yourself as the people are giving us the right to represent you. But we just exposed that government is not representation. It is coercion, therefore it is rulership. So we don't have public servants. It's laughable that people still think that they're public servants, truly, when their job descriptions allow them to rule over us. So what we have is rulers, not representatives. So backing up, what that would mean is that now what we're being told is that we're giving them the right to rule over us. Before, kings and queens were ordained by God, allegedly, to rule over us. Now we're giving them the right to rule over us. But the fallacy here is we ourselves don't have the right to rule over each other. I don't have the right to tax you. I don't have the right to tell you what you can put in your body or what you can, and threaten you with incarceration if you disobey my commands. I don't have the right to tell you what invisible lines you can cross on earth and put you in a cage if you disobey my commands. I don't have the right to, do any of what the government claims the right to do. I don't have the right to do those things to you. Interpersonally, I don't have the right to do it to my neighbor. So how am I giving the government the right to do those things to my neighbor when I myself don't have the right to do those things to my neighbor? If I can't tax you, how do I have the right to vote for someone else to tax you? And say, well, look, I can't tax you, but I'm gonna delegate a right I don't have to someone else, and they're gonna do it. And I have given them the right to do that, even though I don't have the right to do that. How do you give someone something that you don't even have yourself? How can you give away rights that you yourself don't even possess? So if we think we're granting government with the authority to do what it does, and that is what makes it legitimate, it's very important to recognize that we ourselves don't have that authority to give. And you can't delegate a right you don't have. And, we'll continue to come back to this point because it's a very important point to recognize that voting doesn't make any of this legitimate. That what we're really doing is just vowing to our rulers. And interestingly, the word vote means to vow. Etymologically, the word vote means vow. It doesn't mean consent, because none of this is actually consensual, because I can't consent on someone else's behalf to be taxed by someone else. I'm claiming to own that person by imagining I can consent on your behalf how much you have to labor for someone else and what cage you're going to get thrown in if you don't do that. Right? I can't. So when I'm voting, I'm not voting for a system that only affects me. Right? If it was only an arrangement that was affecting you, and it was an arrangement you had with one other person, and you wanted to call that person your president, and you were saying, look, you can take 40% of my labor or 30% of my labor, whatever, and you can even throw me in a cage if I don't give it to you, and you can tell me what I can put in my body and what I can and where I can go on earth, and when it's time to go to war, and if I have to fight in the war, or if I'm the one getting bombed, right? You can decide the fate of my body and my life, and I consent to that. Obviously, that would be a very abusive dynamic that you had with that one other person, and you would be a victim of Stockholm syndrome to acquiesce to such a thing, and people would have the right to try to convince you to come out of that Stockholm syndrome. But at the very least, it would just be affecting you. It would just be an arrangement that you had with that person that you're calling the president. But when you're voting, you're not voting for a system that only affects you, but it affects everyone else. And what right do you have to choose a master for everyone else to obey? What right do you have to enforce that on others? Even if you want that for yourself, which is sad enough, what right do you have to decide that for everyone else? Because when you're voting for a system, well, that system's affecting millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of other people's lives, and billions if you are voting, in India or in China, they have populations like that are above 1 billion. But I mean, I'm pretty sure that is the case for India as well. But if you're voting an imperialistic government like the U.S., right? Well, your government does affect billions of people's lives all around the world. What right do you have to vote for a master for them to have to obey? All the billions of people that are being affected by the system you're voting for. You are imagining by voting for such a system that you own them. And so voting for what we call democracy and voting for presidents is really just like almost like a slave auction, where we're selling each other into bondage, right? Where we're imagining that we own each other and saying, I'm going to choose a master for you to obey as well. And voting doesn't make any of this legit. It's just vowing to a ruling class. It's just to kiss the ring and vow to our masters, who have no right to be our masters. They're not our legitimate rulers. They're just, the only reason they have the authority they have is that people believe in their authority. Otherwise, it's just be a man on television, saying, oh, it's time to go to war. And you say, no, it isn't. You're just some psycho on television, I just flip the channel and that's it. You're just some actor reading a script, and I'm not going to believe in your authority over people's lives in reality. You're just some person on television, right? And if people approach it like that, there wouldn't even be wars. Because who would fight the wars? Not that those at the highest tiers of empire, they don't fight the wars. They don't bloody their own hands. They get the regular people to do it by following their orders and by buying into insane ideologies, and brainwashing people through educational system and other modes, of reaching into people's minds. And people get brainwashed and they obey orders and they think they have the right to do things they have no right to do. And it's all stemming from this mad belief in people's authority. Whereas if it was just, we just approach it like, hey, we think there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and say, like, if George Bush, comes on television or whatever, and whatever insane dictator, politician that has existed throughout human history, they come on television, they start lying, or they give a speech or whatever, and they start lying about what has taken place and why some such and such place needs to be invaded now. And people just laughed at them and said, we're not going to believe you. You're a psychopath. You're trying to get us to murder people, and you're going to get me murdered too while I'm at it. But even if I were to not get murdered, I have to go murder someone else and destroy my own soul and fuck with my own psyche and live with that for the rest of my life. You're going to ask that of me, and I'm supposed to take your word for it on why this is necessary. I'm supposed to believe that there are weapons of mass destruction, or or that 9/11 is what you say it was. All of that is coming from this Stockholm syndrome, believing in the authority, believing in your national identity, believing in some story you've been told since a young age that is totally erroneous. And if a critical mass of people just united and said, no, we're not fighting it, and we're not funding it, well, who would fund the war? Who would fight in the wars? How could they even come and arrest everyone? Because the people would be too numerous. And anyway, you could stop funding the police and the prisons and all of that too. So who would pay for the police and the prisons to stay open? Well, the ruling class would have to do it for themselves. And then there would be no confusion as to who the military and police and prison guards really work for. Right? And at least some of them would come out of their programming at that point and realize, oh no, I work directly for the global ruling class. I work for some sick, psychopathic people in power, and that's who they work for now. But because it's tax funded and it's considered a public institution, everything, this myth that they're actually there to serve and protect can keep getting propagated through the generations, and people are told, oh, you're such a hero for working for the police and keeping the neighborhood safe and everything, and they get patted on the back, and so they're surrounded by a lot of people that, you know, congratulate them for working for these institutions, right? But if people were to unite and say, no, we're not going to fund this war, we're not going to fight in this war, and we're not going to fund the people who would come with guns to drag us into a cage if we refuse to fund the war, and we're not going to fund the cage that we would be thrown in if we refuse to fight in the war, and we're done, and we don't need you, we don't require your services any longer, and we're going to share directly and voluntarily amongst each other and figure it out on our own. Well, that would be that, you know. And if we could get to that level of consciousness among a critical mass, then we could starve the war machine. How else to do it? Expect someone to get into power and they'll do it on our behalf? But what right do you have to choose a master for everyone else to obey in the first place? And why would you believe their lies? Haven't you been paying attention to all the lies they've been telling? Of course, whether it's Obama or Kamala or Trump or whoever, they owe, you know, and this is just in the particular case of the US, right? But they always make promises. They always say they're going to put food on the table and, you know, bring jobs and make things better, and, you know, and they don't deliver on their promises, and then they blame the other side. Well, I couldn't deliver on my promises because the other side was in the way. It's all a scam. The right and the left politicians, they work for the same ruling class empire that's behind the scenes. And they have this little scam going that they can, neither one will deliver on their promises, and then they can always blame the other side. And people still fall for it again and again. And, you know, but to begin with, no one has the right to choose a master for anyone else to obey. And that's, you know, if we could understand that, then we can come to see that voting is not even a right to begin with. And that's not to say voting. Well, this is an important point, because this meme really is referring to voting for a president or prime minister specifically, right? Voting for a political leader. That is not a right, because that is a slave master, and we can expose in great detail that that is the case, right? And prove that. But that is not to say that, let's say, you're trying to get water to your community, or build a bridge, or build some piece of infrastructure, and you're just trying to decide, well, who should we trade with to build that bridge, or build that piece of infrastructure, or deliver that water, because that takes resources, that takes expertise, and we're going to, you know, trade with someone or a group of people that are be able to perform that task. Or you might have, well, how are we going to do it exactly, and all of the specifics that it will entail. And if you're a community trying to make that decision, well, you could take a vote on that, right? Voting in that way is like a taking a poll or a head count in order to make group decisions that involve no harm in either outcome, right? But if what is included on the ballot is the right to rule and someone's right to dominate and forcibly extract labor and, you know, enslave other people, then you don't have the right to vote for that. Whether it's allegedly the lesser of two evils or not, you don't have the right to choose a master for others to obey, right? But you do have the right to vote on, well, should we, you know, work with this group of people or that group of people to build a bridge, and let's put it to the community, because let's see what the majority of people want, but no one's being harmed in either outcome, because you can vote for something that you yourself have the right to do, but you don't have the right to vote for something that you yourself don't have the right to do. So, for example, if you're voting between, one president that's going to bomb people or another that's going to bomb people, and you can surmise that that's the case based on the legacy of those institutions and their history of bombing people, and you can surmise that will continue under either president. Well, you yourself don't have the right to murder people, right? You don't have the right to go and bomb innocent people. So what right do you have to vote for anyone to do something that you don't have the right to do yourself, right? But if you're voting between, well, should we, work with this group of people, that group of people, in order to build this bridge, well, now that might be a convenient way to make a group decision if so desired, right? And as long as you're voting between things that cause no harm in either outcome, then it continues to be a right. But if there's going to be harm in both outcomes, and you're just voting for, well, between two outcomes that both involve the enslavement of others and harm being inflicted on people, well, that ceases to be a right. So, that's one very important difference between anarchy and democracy, is because democracy is ruled by the people, whereas anarchy is without rulers. So democracy is implying that the majority rules gets to determine what's right or wrong, whereas anarchy is honoring that right and wrong is a pre-existing principle. We don't get to take a vote on what's right or wrong. Like, I don't want to. That's like saying, well, you walk up to someone and you say, you and a friend walk up to someone and say, give me 40% of your labor or we're going to beat you up. And they say no. And you say, well, okay, look, we'll take a vote. And you and your friend outvote that person. You give them a chance to vote. You say, vote in favor, for all those in favor of this person having to give us 40% of your labor, raise your hand. And you and your friend raise your hand. For all those not in favor of it, and the person raised their hand and said, okay, well, look, we allowed you to vote. But look, you got outvoted. Now you owe us 40% of your labor, or we're going to beat you up. Right? That's imagining that a majority rules gets to determine what's right or wrong. Whereas human history has shown again and again that the majority within a society can be dead wrong. A majority in a society can be pro-genocide, can be possessed by an insane ideology, imagining that they have the right to do things they have no right to do. Right? And we've seen it again and again and again throughout history. So just because people are in the majority doesn't mean they're right. It's like imagining that we can determine whether mountains exist by taking a vote. Well, if we vote that mountains don't exist and oceans don't exist anymore, I guess they don't exist, and that becomes the law. Well, no, mountains and oceans still exist regardless of the vote, and that is true for what we have the right to do and what we don't have the right to. If we don't, and whether or not we're each other's slaves legitimately, that's not, such a thing is not determined legitimately by a vote. It's a pre-existing principle. Moving on, classic quote by Lysander Spooner, one of the great anarchists who've roamed the earth. A man is no less slave because he allowed to choose a new master once in a term of years. So it's really saying the same thing. And remember, slavery is a spectrum. So, but you're still not free. And the human race itself is enslaved. Regardless of how privileged some people are, the human species itself is not free. The overarching conditions of humanity is one of enslavement, and it's just a question of where you are at on that spectrum. How mentally enslaved are you on that spectrum? How physically enslaved are you? How much economic warfare are you under? How are the bombs falling on you? Are you funding the bombs? Where are you in the caste system? How privileged are you? How much comfort and leisure do you have to just check out from it and be a complicit tax-paying slave within the system, but have enough privilege and comfort to kind of be able to tune that out and just check out and not concern yourself with the responsibility to undo such an immoral system. You know, even people making millions, you know, and having a life of leisure and, you know, making insanely high salaries and everything. Well, what are they funding under coercion? Where are their tax dollars going? Right? Imagine if they say, well, no, we're not going to pay our taxes. You know, you mentioned certain athletes or any athlete, right? You know, all the tens of millions of dollars they make in their career, right? Or hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And yet they're under the coercion, the threat of violence to fund all these very harmful things, both to themselves and to their fellow human beings. And if they were to try to evade taxation, well, now they can, you know, some people with guns can throw them in a cage. So they're not free either. Let's move on. You know, this pretty much speaks for itself. Okay, so the last slide in this in episode 3 is, brother, they lied. This path will only harm you. Choose love. And we'll keep returning to this throughout the presentation. It's all about love. It's all about choosing love, and as opposed to authority, as opposed to obedience, as opposed to domination, but love. You know, love does not require obedience. And we'll get into greater depth of why that is. You know, but authority asks you to obey, to not think for yourself, to not consult your conscience, but just obey. Right? That's what authority asks. That it's not your own responsibility to make sure your behavior is aligning with the principle of justice, right? That's not your responsibility. You're supposed to abdicate that responsibility to your superiors and obey them. And they know what's best for humanity. And you're supposed to just obey them, and they seek to circumvent your critical thinking and your conscience so that you just unthinkingly perform the task that they want you to perform. And they keep people compartmentalized within that hierarchical structure so that people don't have all of the knowledge they would need to know why they shouldn't do such and such thing, because they might not know the whole agenda of the institution they work for and what the bigger picture is, because they're compartmentalized within that structure. So, you know, whereas choosing love would really set humanity on a whole different path. And obviously, thank goodness, some people have done that, but much higher numbers are needed of people who truly choose love. So we'll leave the episode 3 there and continue with episode 4 in the next video.